I'm Eileen Legaspi-Ramirez, writer, researcher, and teacher at the University of the Philippines, Department of Art Studies. And this is the Scrapbooks of Purita Kalaw-Ledesma. It was in the mid-90s as I was just beginning my art studies graduate journey, still thinking through then if I would devote research and writing to my grandfather's practice, which is what set me off to the old building where the ASEAN Institute of Art Library was also still housed. I still have very visceral memories of this as I met Purita in the flesh, and the image of her holding court over the ephemera on and around her desk that would eventually coalesce in what is now the archive. This still very much imprints on my mind. In a real sense, the no frills buckle down to the matters at hand impression she made on me as a then still very naive researcher. This has been a durable peg, particularly when I find myself on very long, sometimes hapless searches for answers to nagging questions I've had about the world I'd been born into, initially living in my grandfather's home, and then eventually navigating the bigger landscape as writer, researcher, teacher. I hesitate to use the word unique precisely because potentially any research encounter is nuanced by so many factors. The implicit research frame one brings upon the material shapes what we look for, how we look, and how we think through what we find. I think what helped me as I first encountered the material was that I was coming into art history as a discipline functioning within a climate of suspicion about the structures of knowledge production. This included institutions, publications, and definitive pronouncements from the reigning thinkers and writers of the time. I went into the archive thinking rather irreverently that way. Of course, I also had the benefit of hindsight and was much less invested in perpetuating what had already rather calcified as art historical junctures in Philippine accounts, like the modernist conservatives debates, the avant-garde SR impasse, etc. And that's why maybe too I was a little more attentive to unexplored and potential narratives. This is why after I'd done the 70s essay for the 2017 book, The Life and Times of Purita Kalaw, I had so much more to think through and write about. Thus, the essay on how the personal art practices of women like Purita and Lid Argilia took a backseat to their tending to the very real needs of an art world where few male artists were willing to take on tedious tasks like documentation, organization, and networking. From my reading, this was clearly a time when those in art were still only trying to find their own coordinates. Groping in the shadows was how I put it in 2015. This was very patent in my reading within the archive, but also in tandem with rereading books Purita had written, like The Struggle for Philippine Art and The Biggest Little Room. So the essay, Art on the Back Burner, Gender as the Elephant in the Room of Southeast Asian Art Histories from 2019, was born of that earlier research time too. I think we forget that surfacing critical ideas and attempting intertextuality requires real labor and ideally unhurried time to let thoughts percolate and congeal. That essay, Art on the Back Burner, which apparently resonates across past our borders, would not have been written if I hadn't gotten the time to see how much of the spade work was obviously being taken on by Purita and Lid. Having been steeped in organizing and publication work since the 90s, it was very easy for me to identify with how these women would essentially lose themselves in the work to get critical tasks accomplished. It spurred me to look for parallels across other nascent art worlds in the neighborhood. What the archives potentially allow is an intertextual reading and writing of art history. There is no getting around lodging into the necessary headspace and doing the work of reading, sifting, counter reading, given other accounts that suggest affinities. I still do cherish the privilege of spending a concentrated amount of time I had with the archive leading up to the making of The Life and Times of Purita Kalaw monograph launched in 2017. I would do that all over again if I didn't have to teach and tend to pending projects. Initially, I was to write on 4 decades for the PKL book, but ended up doing the essay mostly on the 70s because those volumes alone set me off on so many tangents as a researcher. You see, I grew up as a martial law baby, and I still think that that accident of fate consigned my generation to state imposed ignorance and compliance. Finding that I could unearth, even tentatively put articulations from writers, historians, artists, and critics who no longer get read today, and from other key art agents who navigated around the Marcos cultural infrastructure. This unexpected data lent much clarity to how I sought to rethink the 70s. I think the capacity to look back that way is precious, especially for critical junctures, bookended by martial law, as well as later phases such as the post-EDSA remaking of cultural establishments and power realignments. There is still much to be mined from the archives to help us make better sense of these pregnant sociocultural pivots. Needless to say, it has helped logistically, having to not have to impose myself bodily on the center's good graces. Aging eyes looking and reading on a screen does have health drawbacks. But you can at least zoom in if the scans are good enough to gain detail from. The trade off of keeping the scrapbooks intact are unarguably important, of course. Although there is still no substitute for being able to spot juxtapositions that become more readily apparent when you are handling the scrapbooks physically and even have some of the art and attendant objects around you. What I would strongly suggest, given the push to digitize, is to more avidly invest in creating multiple indices. These could enable better searches and cross referencing. Hopefully, without overstating this, I think there are still virtually boundless directions of writing that might emanate if this and other archives are more decidedly opened up to researchers. Archives should be working together to effect a robust ecology where those who ask different and difficult questions ought be welcomed as they imagine how threads of materials in physically disjointed spaces may be woven into stories that resonate with those in the field today. These narratives, in turn, might help those who come after us as they do their own grappling with what confounded us during our own historical times. Perhaps some collaboratively run research residencies across archives might help this happen too. I reread what I'd churned from diving into the archive, tried to recall what it was like encountering so much of this material the first time as virtual tabula rasa in the 90s, having still to more avidly shift from journalism and social development research. And then returning to the archive in the middle of the last decade when I'd become far more deeply embedded in the field. I was looking with different lenses at both times, pretty much like the adage, you never step into the same river twice. It doesn't completely surprise me that I still feel as strongly about these reading and writing exercises. In 2015, I'd attested to how that second, much more prolonged encounter allowed a mode of negotiation with documents once seen as dispensable and granular. and yet possibly now imprinted with provisional associative logics. In exploring archives as fairly loosely assembled information structures, there is space and breathing room left for new thinking to happen. This is not to say that new is always the way to go, but as fellow editor Keith Wallace, who was working out of China, once said, there is much to be said about writing from a place of doubt. I've generally felt pleasure in letting both mind and body bask in the process of finding, getting perplexed, figuring out, and plunging back into asking. It can be lonely because solace comes with the territory, but my take is that digging into what has been amassed and pre-selected and kept for us by figures like Purita help keep our researchers' edges sharp. Purita remained curious and kept wanting to learn up through the time she finally set aside the task of archiving, thus effectively charging inquisitive eyes and minds coming after her to take up the necessary labor of weighing in and writing alongside the data that grows because we complicate it, hacking at what seems to be self evident and is already settled for all time. We participate in conversations that outlive us this way, and I'm very honored to have happened on some hospitable cubby space here, where I join similarly spirited souls wagering on the gains of dislodging the grip of merely received knowledge.